sound. Ooh. Okay, we're ready to go. I guess I muted everybody by accident, but I'll introduce myself. My name is Evan Weiner. I am a journalist. I've been a journalist since 1971, Spring Valley High School, Rockland County, New York, 11th grade. Joe Dionisio was my teacher. It was English. He said, "Student, you have a good voice. How would you like to be on radio?" And I said, "In the worst way." And I was. WRKL Radio, Mount Ivy, New York, the home of Mitch Miller. Remember Sing Along with Mitch? He lived there. And within 7 years, I was on WNEW in New York because John Lindsay told me he was running for Senate, state of New York. And some of you might remember WNEW, which featured William B. Williams, among others. I've written for newspapers, magazines, been a TV pundit, radio, and I don't do windows. I'll vacuum, but I don't do windows. The games must go on. It's about the Olympics, and it's about the politics of the Olympics, not necessarily the games in any way, shape, or form. The games must go on was Ivry Brundage, 1972, after the Israeli massacre, the 9 athletes and the 2 coaches killed in the terrorist attacks. The games suspended for a day, and then Brundage gives this long-winded talk, 23 words or so, to our Israeli friends. And basically the substance was the games must go on. Death, no big deal. The games must go on. And in Tokyo, apparently the games must go on, as we are 29 days from the opening ceremony, probably with the time difference, 28 days by this point. And as of right now, there will be a 2020 in 2021 Tokyo Olympics, the COVID edition. The games must go on. And that is the mantra that Thomas Bach, who is the International Olympic Committee president, continues. And there is a guy in Tokyo, and there's a lot of protests going on, or are a lot of protests going on in Tokyo and in Japan. Medical people say we can't have this. The average person in the street, we can't have this. Japan is way behind in vaccinations, and yet there's a lot of money here, a lot of money on the table, and that's why the games must go on. Now, let me talk about the International Olympic Committee for a second here, although I could probably talk, and we have Kent Anderson in here, who's also a Paralympian, who could probably add to me, so we could talk for the next 55 hours about the International Olympic Committee, but I'll keep it short and sweet today. The International Olympic Committee has permanent observer status at the United Nations. The Vatican has permanent observer status at the United Nations. In many ways, the International Olympic Committee acts as if it's a sovereign nation, and it has been requiring presidents and prime ministers and other leaders to genuflect in front of them and their group in the Olympic bidding. In the case of the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, the IOC, not the government of Japan, the International Olympic Committee calls the shots. The Japanese government might be able to suggest, hey, maybe we should not have it, but at the end of the day, it's a deal between the local committee, the Tokyo Committee, and the International Olympic Committee. And as of right now, the International Olympic Committee is not backing down. This guy is John Coates. He's the vice president of the International Olympic Committee. He's an Australian lawyer. And back in May of 2021, a long time ago, right now, really about a month ago, Thomas Bach and Coates were not worried that 10 areas in Japan were in a lockdown. Coates said it's now clearer than ever that the games would be safe for everyone participating, as well as the general public in Japan. Might I remind you, Coates is a lawyer and more than likely has never spent more than about 3 minutes of his entire career looking into a microscope, seeing antibodies and all that other stuff that goes into diagnosing or getting a cure for COVID-19 or a vaccine. But he was confident that the games must go on. But the Tokyo Medical Practitioners Association pointed out hospitals locally have their hands full. and have almost no capacity left to deal with a possible outbreak triggered by the Olympics. And if the Olympic athletes have a problem, they may have a serious problem. The major problem, of course, at hand is the COVID-19 pandemic. And the IOC cannot control the illness. They think they can. They think they can control everything, but they can't control the illness. Japan was in a lockdown until May 31st, and then until recently, they're out of a lockdown right now. There is a new poll which suggests that 3/5 of the country's residents think the games must not go on because of the pandemic. Go home, or don't come. Japan is going to take a massive hit in the range of billions of dollars or yen, whether the event takes place or not. Some suggestions, they've invested $25 billion into the games right now. And we're not even talking about the nuclear disaster that the games took money from that they needed to clean up from 2013. And the IOC seemingly is taking a blind eye to everything going on. COVID-19 could lock down the country, but not an Olympics. Go home. The IOC in Japan have agreed to bar tourists from entering Japan to watch the game, but millions of people in Japan could attend the competitions at the more than 40 venues in and around Tokyo. The IOC told the Wall Street Journal about 2 weeks ago that they are in the operational delivery phase of the Olympics, and that it has become clearer than ever that these games will be safe for everyone participating and the Japanese people. Again, there probably aren't too many scientists connected with the International Olympic Committee unless they're looking for somebody who's blood doping. But the IOC is absolutely guaranteeing Japan, hey, no problem. Now we come to June, cancel the Olympics. But is it safe? Well, Japan's having a massive problem getting its citizens vaccinated against COVID-19. As of June 8th, only 4% of the Japanese population got a shot. Japan hopes to have most of its population vaccinated by November, but the games start on July 23rd. They end in early August, and then the Paralympics start probably 10 days after that. So you're going into September, and most of the population still will not be vaccinated by September. But the games must go on. And there's a vaccination of a Brazilian athlete. Just the other day, an International Olympic Committee spokesperson said that well above 80% of the residents of the Olympic and Paralympic Village in Tokyo will be vaccinated, and somewhere between 70 and 80% of the media will be vaccinated. But you got that 20% that won't be, and that's the people that the Tokyo medical people are really, really worried about. But the games must go on. 1972, Thomas Bach insisting in March of 2020 that the 2020 Tokyo Games would take place as scheduled starting on July 24th. But he was meeting resistance in March of 2020 because a number of Olympic committees said, maybe with this pandemic, and we were in the very early stages of the pandemic in March of 2020, maybe it would be wiser to shelve the plans and hold the gathering at another time when coronavirus drug treatments and vaccines are available. Bach said no, and then a couple of days later, the rug was pulled out and the games postponed for a year. The 2020 Olympics, COVID-19 cases were increasing at that point, and there was a fight among the Japanese organizers and the Japanese government about the cost of delaying the event and who should pay the extra expenses that are going to become due. They haven't figured that out yet, but the International Olympic Committee, they're people with short arms and long pockets. And by the way, if you do shake hands with people like the late one, Antonio Samaranch, which I did, he used to run the IOC, make sure you count your fingers after you shake hands with him, because you might not have all five. Suga Yoshihide is the prime minister of Japan, and his prestige is on the line right now. They know the games are costing more than $25 billion. Businesses locally want the games. Media interest. Now, the media interest that includes Comcast. Let me just see if Jim Williams is in here, because if Jim is in here, yeah, Jim's here, I think. Do I see Jim? No, I don't see Jim. Jim was supposed to stop by. He didn't stop by. It's okay. Jim had produced and directed Olympic segments over the years. Comcast in the United States, owner of NBC, needs the games. They have invested a lot of money. They have a lot of advertising. They do not want to see the games go away, because they would have to make givebacks or give givebacks to advertisers who spent hundreds upon hundreds of millions of dollars on this two-week sports orgy. So they want it. Also, the international media wants it. CBC, I think, has the rights in Canada, and all the other people. They have planned to make some money off of this thing, and they need product. If they have no product, again, the advertising money goes away. And for the prime minister, it's going to be a test of his ability to handle the pandemic. So July 23rd, about 28 days away now in Japan. And the next 28 days, hey, it's the operational phase, but we will see what happens. The COVID-19 rate has decreased in Japan. So maybe, just maybe, they'll get lucky this time around. But, you know, about the Olympics and about playing around with science and playing around with research and playing around with political platforms, the Olympics has always been about that. The modern Olympics started in 1896. And by the way, there will be no foreign fans. No local spectators are allowed, only 50% capacity at venues, or up to 10,000 fans. And there will be the COVID-19 protocols of distancing, mask wearing, and don't cheer loud, which means they may not be able to whistle either. But getting back to what I was talking about, the Olympics, it's more than just sports. Way more than a sporting event. The modern Olympics began in Athens in 1896. Games were politicized by 1936, and there's an Olympic tennis player, a very modest-looking Olympic tennis player, because that's the way you had to look to play tennis in the Olympics in 1900. By 1904, let's do some scientific research, and for 2 days in St. Louis, coinciding with the St. Louis World's Fair, the research part of the Olympics, the anthropology days and games. And this was really kind of sad in a way. They were looking for, the Olympic organizers, were looking for savages to bring to St. Louis to basically the traditional Olympic events on one day, and then other kind of events the next day. 2-day event in St. Louis. Uncivilized tribes competed in Olympic events of the day. It was a guy by the name of James E. Sullivan who brought the games to St. Louis. Originally, it was supposed to be in Chicago, to coincide with the 1904 World's Fair. The 2-day event was meant to show, according to Sullivan, that Anglo-America's culture was superior in how savages could not compete in sports. This is part of the Olympic legacy. And there is Baron Pierre de Coubertin, who was the founder of the modern Olympics, and a guy who didn't want women around. And they made a statement in 1912. The Baron, and you'll find if you go around the Olympics, there are a number of barons and lords and earls, like out of work royalty that somehow ended up in the IOC. In 1912, the Baron and many of his IOC colleagues believed in an Olympiad with females would be impractical, uninteresting, and improper. They didn't think women belonged in the Olympics. In 1914, the IOC General Session made it clear, no women to participate in track and field. but as before, allowed to participate in fencing and in swimming. That's Alice Milliet, and she was a French athlete who decided, hey, listen, let's be involved. No, you can't be involved. Let us be involved. No, you can't be involved. You know what? I'm going to show you. We're going to start our own Olympics. And there was the Women's Olympics. That was the alternative to the male-centric games. There were 4 Women Olympics games staged: 1922 in Paris, 1926 Sweden, 1930 in Prague, 1934 in London. Most of the participants came from North America, Western Europe, and from Japan. The New York Times had an article back in 1922 covering the Paris Olympics, the Women Olympics, and said the 1922 Women's Olympics was notable for the development of women athletes in all branches of competition fitting to their sex. Remarkable progress was made by them, and almost overnight, they assumed a place of great prominence in the world of athletics. By 1932, the Los Angeles Games, track and field was back in. Other women's sports would continue to be added to the Olympics. And by 1934, the Women's Olympics was gone. Franklin Roosevelt, 1936. There was no more politically charged Olympics to that time than the 1936 Olympics. And I went up to Hyde Park, went up to see Franklin and Eleanor. Really nice, really nice host. A little stiff, didn't have much to say, had books waiting for you. And me and my wife were there. And I had to ask FDR 3 things. One about the 1936 Olympics, another about being the first person on television, because he would talk about that in the United States, and also why he allowed baseball to continue after Pearl Harbor. And I got answers to all 3. 1936 Olympics. You go there, you legitimize Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime. And there were people in the United States who were not happy with the fact that there might be a team representing the United States at the Berlin Games. In 1935, the former Assistant Secretary for the United States Navy, Ernest Lee Jackey, and Jeremiah Mahoney, who was a New York lawyer, and also the head of the American Athletic Association, and they were in charge of the Olympics. And in fact, it was Mahoney and his people that helped give Berlin the Olympics back in 1931 before Hitler was there. They pushed for a boycott of the 1936 Berlin Games. Jankey was an American International Olympic Committee delegate, expressed outrage with reports of what was going on within Hitler's Germany. On November 25th, 1935, he sent a letter to the IOC president. Told you, count. This one's a count, not an earl or a lord or a baron. This one's a count. Count Henri Ballet-Latour, floating the initial idea of an American boycott of the 1936 Games. Mahoney announced that we should have a boycott on December 8th, 1935, as he recommends that America drops out of the Berlin Games. He would go around the country, join with a number of U.S. Catholic leaders, including the Governor Al Smith from New York and Massachusetts Governor James Curley, calling for the boycott, but Roosevelt said no. He said, go ahead. He knew full well about what was going on within Germany, and he had no problem sending the team there. He didn't think athletes should be involved in protests. Avery Brundage. Oh, Avery Brundage, oddly enough, he took Jankey's place as an IOC delegate and then became the head of the United States Olympic Committee. And he would be there in 36 and in Munich in 1972. And he overrules Mahoney and the AAU and says to the Olympians, go compete in Berlin. I worked with Marty Glickman in the 1980s with his broadcast school and NBC. Marty Glickman, I knew Sam Stoller. Sam ran the Melrose Games, and Gretel Bergman, Margaret Lambert, who ended up in Forest Hills. I interviewed her in 1993, and I believe Bruce Morton, who was here, also might have been with us that day that we interviewed Gretel at the New York Athletic Club. Those three and Jesse Owens and others would be impacted by the Berlin Olympic Games. Gretel, well, Gretel, she never was able to compete in the games. Why? Well, she was German. 2 weeks before the Olympics began, German officials informed the Jewish athlete Gretel Bergmann that she was denied a place on the team, although she had equaled the German women's record in the high jump. The Germans sacrificed the chance for a gold medal with that action. And I talked to her years ago, and I said, why? Why'd you compete? She said, I was the great Jewish hope. And she said, I had to give my people something to hang on to, something to hang on to. You don't realize how bad things were in 1935, 1936 in Germany. And maybe I just gave them some hope. She fled Germany in 1937 with her boyfriend, who's soon to be her husband, Dr. Bruno Lambert. She landed in New York or Ellis Island, $10. That was it, $10. And he had $10, and they had to make their way through the new country. She worked as a masseuse, a housemaid, physical therapist. She got a new life in America. She was on the United States women's high jump team, or the track and field team, the national team in 37-38, winning the women's high jump championships and the 1937 shot put championships. She would marry Dr. Bruno Lambert in 1938, an athlete she met in Europe, and she received her citizenship in 1942. She would fade into obscurity until her introduction into the Jewish Hall of Fame at the Wingate Institute in Israel in 1980. Her legacy, the IOC gave her a medal at the Atlanta Olympics in 1996. They knew she was going to win a gold medal. Fuchs and Russ Leventhal over at HBO, they were hounding her. We want to do a special on you. We want to do a special on you, but you got to go back to Germany. In that interview she gave in 1993 to me, Mark Schneider, and others, she said she was never going back to Germany. But Fuchs and Levinson got her to go back to Germany in 1999, where they were shooting for a special. The stadium in Lapham, where she used to train, was named in her honor. The HBO special was called Hitler's Pawn. Very good. You definitely, if you could get a hold of it, or if you could get it in the library, it's a highly recommended, enjoyable documentary they did on her. And she talks about those days back in the 30s and also going back. And she passed away 4 years ago at the age of 103 in Forest Hills. As far as FDR, no boycott. There's Marty Glickman on the left. He's 18 years old. He's the fastest boy in Brooklyn. And on the right is Sam Stoller. And they never did compete because Avery Brundage pulled them. And Marty felt that Avery did that to spare the Fuhrer the embarrassment of seeing two Jews from New York on the podium with gold medals. So instead, he got to see Ralph Metcalf and Jesse Owens, and Owens won all the gold medals and stole the show, and Hitler would turn his back on Jesse Owens. In 1964, South Africa is thrown out of the Olympic movement. Again, politics. It was August 18th, 1964. They were barred from the Olympics, barred from taking part in the 18th Olympics Games in Tokyo, Japan. This year's Olympics, the first since 1964, Summer Olympics for Tokyo, because they refused to condemn apartheid. South Africa was also tossed out of the International Olympic Committee's group of nations in 1970 because of its apartheid policy. 1968, and there is Tommy Smith in the middle, John Carlos on the right, Peter Norman on the left, and that is after the race that they were in and winning the gold medal in terms of Smith and the bronze medal in terms of Carlos, and Norman wins the silver medal. And they were protesting a whole bunch of things, particularly poverty in the United States and other oppression. Smith originally advocated for a boycott of the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City. South Africa and Rhodesia were uninvited. or they didn't want them invited to the Olympics. They wanted the restoration of Muhammad Ali's world heavyweight boxing title, which was stripped of him without due process in 1967, after he decided he was not going to be inducted into the United States military. They wanted Avery Brundage to step down as president of the IOC, and they wanted the hiring of more African-American assistant coaches. But they decided to go, and they planned a protest. And they got Peter Norman to get involved with it as well. As Smith and Carlos walked to the podium, they took off their shoes to protest poverty. They wore beads and a scarf to protest lynchings. And when the national anthem was played, they lowered their heads in defiance and raised their fists in a Black Power salute that rocked the world. Their gloves were split. Peter Norman, the Australian, who was the silver medal winner, suggested to them, take off your gloves, and then Black Power salute. And there they are at the podium. There is Norman, who suggested to the two, take off your gloves. They are wearing patches supporting human rights. And Carlos and Smith, over the years, have had talks about what they've done or what they did almost 53 years ago. I don't like the idea of people looking at it as a negative, said Smith. There was nothing but a raised fist in the air and a bowed head, acknowledging the American flag, not symbolizing a hatred for it. Carlos, who worked as a guidance counselor at the Palm Springs High School in California, told the Guardian newspaper, I had a moral obligation to step up. Morality was a far greater force than the rules and regulations that they had. Now, Smith went on to become a college track and field coach. My wife's cousin, who lives up here in Westchester, Nathan, was on his teams in Oberlin, and they kept close touch. So Smith did okay. Actually, Carlos did okay. After it took years, but they were okay in terms of career-wise, what they did. Peter Norman wasn't. 1968, on his left breast uniform, the Australian wore a small badge that read Olympic Project for Human Rights, an organization set up a year previously by Harry Edwards, who taught at Berkeley and was the guy who went through all the steps with Colin Kaepernick. What's going to happen to you if you continue your protests? So there's that link between those guys and Colin Kaepernick. Norman suggested that Carlos and Smith split the gloves. Norman asked a member of the United States rowing team if he could borrow a badge that read Olympic Project for Human Rights, a project set up to oppose racism in sports. He didn't fare well. Actually, Tommy Smith got a shot in the American Football League, although it was pretty much, by this point, a combined National Football League, American Football League deal in 1969 with the Cincinnati Bengals. Paul Brown didn't care about his protest during the national anthem. I once asked Paul Brown about that. He said, I don't care. I don't care if a guy is green, red, yellow, orange, white, black. If the guy can play football, he's going to be on my team. Smith and Carlos played in the AFL, NFL. Smith played a season with the Bengals, 1969. Carlos ended up 1 year with the Philadelphia Eagles, but he was injured after being drafted by the Eagles, and 1 year in the Canadian Football League. Brett Musburger, who is now telling something in Las Vegas, a betting show, which is up Brett's course. 1968. People forget this about Musburger. 1968. He's writing for the Chicago American newspaper. And he says Smith and Carlos looked like a couple of black-skinned stormtroopers holding aloft their black-gloved hands during the playing of the national anthem. They sprinkled their symbolism with black track shoes and black scarves and Black Power medals. It's destined to go down in history as the most unsubtle demonstration in the history of protest. I have problems with Brett Musburger professionally. I'm not going to get into that right now. But that's what he wrote in 1968. He prospered. He prospered while Norman suffered. Oh, Musburger was still at it 49 years later with Colin Kaepernick on Twitter. Yo, 49ers, since you instigated protests, 2 wins and 19 losses, how about taking your next knee in the other team's end zone? Musburger still works. As far as the medals, the IOC never kept their medals or took the medals away from Smith and Carlos, nor were they asked to return them to the IOC. Norman became a non-citizen in Australia. He qualified for the 1972 Olympic Australian team by merit. He won his races and all that other stuff, yet he wasn't on the team. He died in 2006. Carlos and Smith were his pallbearers in 2012, 6 years after he passed away in 2006. The Australian Parliament issued a formal apology to the family of Peter Norman, saying that they went overboard in blackballing him and making him virtually a non-citizen. Avery Brundage, 1972, Munich Olympics. Prior to the beginning of the Munich Olympics in 1972, Avery Brundage, who is now the International Olympic Committee president, gives an interview to local media in Germany, and he calls the 1936 Berlin Olympics the finest Olympics ever. The Munich 11, those are the 9 athletes and 2 coaches that were killed in a terrorist attack, the first time that Americans saw terrorism, international terrorism, in their living rooms. The massacre. The attack at the Olympic Village, September 5th, 1972, begins at 4:30 in the morning local time. 8 Palestinian militants affiliated with Black September, a militant offshoot of the Palestinian group Fatah, Yasser Arafat's group, scaled a fence surrounding the Olympic Village in Munich. Disguised as athletes, using stolen keys, they forced their way into the quarters of the Israeli Olympic team. And the hostage situation goes on for hours and hours and hours and hours. About 10 o'clock that night, local time, 4 o'clock New York time, September 5th, German officials thought they had reached an agreement. The terrorists would take their bound and blindfolded hostages from their quarters, put them into buses arranged by the German government, and then we go into waiting helicopters. Jim McKay was on ABC that day. Jim McManus, his son Sean McManus runs CBS now, CBS Sports. And McKay was great, absolutely great in his role as the narrator to the American public. By 12:30 that afternoon, or that evening, or morning, September 6th, and it would be afternoon in New York, 6:30, the shooting stopped. It was at an airport. The 20-hour reign of terror was over. 11 Israelis killed, 1 Munich policeman dead, 5 Black September terrorists dead. 3 of the gunmen were captured. It was a botched rescue by the Germans. 3 o'clock in the morning local time, 9 o'clock Eastern time, prime time on ABC, McKay, who was on for 14 straight hours, summarized the tragic outcome of the botched rescue with these words: "They're all gone." It's a failure. German authorities never did storm Building 31. They allowed the terrorists to take the hostages by helicopter to a nearby military airbase. The Germans had planned an ambush and rescue operation, but it was badly bungled. 9 Israeli hostages killed by a combination of terrorist gunfire and a hand grenade one of the Palestinians set off in the helicopter as it sat in the ground. Richard Nixon. Dick Nixon. 1972, Dick Nixon is absolutely irate. I used Dick Nixon because I kind of knew him a little bit. After 1985, he settled the baseball umpires dispute. He used to hang out in Yankee Stadium and Shea Stadium because he had nothing else to do. And so I once asked President Nixon, he said, "Call me Dick, call me Dick." Anyway, he sends a telegram to Brundage. He demands the rest of the games be called off. But there's Avery. The games must go on. At a memorial service on September 6th, Brundage announced that the games would continue. Brundage was a central character in German history. And there's one other guy who I interviewed in 1999, Mark Spitz. There he is with all of his medals from swimming in 1972. And I asked Mark Spitz, who might have been a high value target for terrorists at the Olympics in 1972, asked him to tell me about his experiences there. The Jewish American swimmer set a record, winning 7 gold medals, and he was sprinted out of Munich to London in fear he would be a target of other terrorists. A news conference celebrating Spitz's achievements was canceled. And this is what he told me in 1999. The swimming program had stopped. I swam all of my events, and that evening, the last day of competition was on a Monday, and this happened on a Tuesday on the morning. Swimming was through, so I didn't have to compete anymore. I had a press conference right afterwards on Tuesday, and that's when everyone told me about this Israeli tragedy, or the thing that was happening at the time. It hadn't turned into a major tragedy at the moment, at least at that time. They didn't know much about it. The next day, I was whisked away. Brundage, 27-word tribute to our Israeli friends. The games must go on. Brundage, who was the IOC, that's who he was. The International Olympic Committee ordered that the competition start 34 hours after a 34-hour pause. I don't know how we got to number 34, but that was it. Howard Cosell once told me that Avery Brundage reached manhood during the time of William of Orange. And if you ever go to Delft in the Netherlands, there is a bar in Delft called William von Orange. I sent that to that picture to Cosell's grandkids, and they were laughing. They said, "Papa always told us that." Apartheid and the Olympic boycott of 1976, 25 African-American countries skipped the 1976 Summer Olympics because New Zealand's rugby team played contests in apartheid South Africa. The African countries protested to the IOC about the IOC's refusal to ban New Zealand from the 76 Montreal Games. Well, New Zealand was in, they were out. Egypt was the last country to drop out. And they played in this thing called the Big O, O-W-E, not the Big O as in the Olympics. Why? The legacy, besides the African boycott of the 1976 Montreal Games, is debt. The Olympic Stadium was supposed to cost $250 million Canadian and ended up with a price tag of $1.4 billion Canadian. The city, the province of Quebec in Canada, did not pay off the 1976 Montreal Olympics debt until November 2006, or 30 years after the closing ceremonies. That is Jim Craig and my son, 1995, which means I'm going to talk about the 1980 Olympics, which Jim Craig, if you remember, was the goaltender on the American team who had the flag draped around his uniform asking, "Where's my father? Where's my father? Where's my father?" The 1980 American boycott of the Moscow Olympics. Jimmy Carter, the president, forces the USOC, the United States Olympic Committee, to drop out of the 1980 Moscow Games because of the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan on December 24th, 1979. The Carter Doctrine. The Carter Doctrine, which said that the Soviets' attempt to gain control of Afghanistan and possibly the region was regarded as a threat to U.S. interests. This is 41 years ago, still playing around in Afghanistan. And Carter was prepared to meet the threat with military force. Jimmy Carter's official announcement came on January 20th in the form of an ultimatum on Meet the Press with Lawrence Spivak. Unless the Soviets withdraw their troops within a month from Afghanistan, the Olympic Games, he would have the boycott, and he would continue that the Olympic Games need to be moved from Moscow to an alternative site or multiple sites, or be postponed or canceled. Nobody listened to Jimmy Carter. Meanwhile, the United States Olympic team's up in Lake Placid, and they're playing the Soviets on a Friday afternoon. A couple of weeks earlier, they were blasted by the Soviets at Madison Square Garden, but they get into this medal round, and it's a funky medal round. You could actually end up winning a game and losing a game, but if you score more goals than anybody else, you could win the gold medal. So this is February 24th, 1980. It's the afternoon. Nobody in the United States is watching this game except the people inside the Lake Placid Arena or in the border cities, Buffalo, Detroit, in Washington State, where they got CBC. And that game was live on CBC. February 24th, 1980, the United States hockey team beat Finland to win the gold medal at the Olympics. An achievement, yes, but it's the game 2 days earlier, February 22nd, George Washington's birthday, that people remember. Because the Americans, a bunch of scraggly college kids and one pro, beat the veteran Soviet Union professionals in a game that most people didn't even know was being played. The Americans upset the heavily favored Soviet teams, and this is in the middle of the Cold War. Soviets had set up shop in Afghanistan, and these Olympics, or this Olympic game, became bigger than life after people knew about it, and it was shown at night. And there is the game. Afterwards, the Americans win. Mike Eruzione, who made a career out of one goal, scores the goal to beat the Soviets. But that doesn't guarantee the Americans are going to win the gold medal. Soviets, under the rules of the day, could beat Czechoslovakia the next day, pile up 16 goals. Americans could lose to Finland. Soviets could win the gold medal. The hockey game takes place February 22nd. The Americans win. The game takes on a life of its own. It becomes known as Miracle on Ice because of the call Al Michaels at the end of the game. Do you believe in miracles? Yes. He was the only guy who knew anything about hockey on the ABC staff who could announce a hockey game. That's why he was there. Do you believe in miracles? Yes. Oh, the Lake Placid game, first event in the United States or first event ever, whether it's a sports event or something else, where the chant USA, USA, USA was heard. Jimmy Carter called to congratulate the team for beating the Soviets. It was only a game. However, politically and culturally, it was the most significant sports matchup of the 20th century. Nothing has come close because of the circumstances. Should we boycott the Olympics? Asked Newsweek. On March 21st, 1980, Carter announces the U.S. will boycott the Olympic Games scheduled to take place in Moscow that summer. The announcement came after the Soviets failed to comply with the February 20th, 1980 deadline to withdraw its troops from Afghanistan. Time magazine, grain as a weapon. Who wins? Who loses? Carter not only had the boycott, he was doing a few other things. He increased the pressure on the Soviets to abandon the war in Afghanistan, issued trade embargoes on 2 U.S. goods, grain and informational technology, computer stuff. He also restricted Soviet fishing in American-controlled waters. The U.S. team, 160 athletes, coaches, and support staff couldn't go to Moscow. And to show that he was meaning business, any athlete who thought about going to Moscow to compete, Carter said, we're going to get rid of your passport if you disobey my order. So the Soviet boycott was on. Carter did get other countries to follow his lead, but Britain, France, Greece, and Australia, not going. We're not listening to you, Jimmy. Canada, West Germany, and Japan joined the boycott. Oh, by the way, we're USA started Lake Placid, the Olympic Village. This is its legacy. It's an upstate New York prison now. Carter's initiative failed. The Soviets remained in Afghanistan until 1989. The Soviets or BRIC countries boycotted the 1984 Los Angeles Games in Los Angeles. That is Ronnie Henry. That's my friend Ronnie Henry. He just had a birthday the other day. Called him. All was cool up in Seattle with him. That's Ronnie and I up in Seattle. And he was part of the group that went to the White House in 1977 and was waiting for Jimmy Carter, who never showed up. They wanted Carter's help in securing the games for Los Angeles in 1994. The International Olympic Committee has only 2 countries that are bidding for the 1984 Olympics, Los Angeles and Tehran. And this is before the Shah leaves and all that other stuff in 1977, and before the embassy in 1979. But the IOC didn't want any part of Iran. No other groups bid for the games, so they said, Los Angeles, you have it because we want to save it, because if you don't take it, we might be out of business. Peter Ueberroth commercialized the games, and the LAOC turned a profit. Virtually every Olympics since 1984 has lost money. The 2004 Athens Games contributed to Greece's insolvency. And of course, the Soviets and the Warsaw Pact countries boycotted the 1984 Los Angeles Games. Roone Arledge, who ran ABC at the time, paying for the games, demanded money back from the IOC, and he kind of laughed at him and said, get lost. ABC has never covered an Olympics, or hasn't covered an Olympics since then. Oh, 1996, the Atlanta legacy. Well, there was the Richard Jewell movie. There was the bombing, killed one person. And the legacy is basically this. The Atlanta Olympic Stadium, where the Atlanta Braves played baseball for about 20 years before moving out to Cobb County. The stadium's been downsized and is being used by a local university to play football. In the 21st century, Athens, those games a major drain on Greece and remain so to this day. 2006, the IOC wants Italy to change drug laws. They want to enforce drug laws like doping and all that other stuff. Italy had very major drug laws, and the IOC said, Jacques Roche said, let us take care of it. They only deserve to be thrown out of the Olympics for 2 years. We'll take care of it. In the 21st century, China becomes more accepted in the world and hosts the 2008 Games. Vancouver, the 2010 deal included censorship of speakers at the libraries, local libraries in Vancouver, if they were anti-Olympics. Tony Blair, Vladimir Putin, Lula, three leaders who genuflected and begged the IOC for the Olympic Games. Blair in 2005, Putin in 2007. Blair did get the London Games in 2012. Putin got on his hands and knees and got the Sochi Games in 2014, the Winter Games. The IOC was interested in these people, the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. More than a decade ago, 15 years ago, the international sports world fell in love with the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and decided those countries had economies that were really heating up. Time to get a piece of the action. Brazil, country had oil, lots of it, and the money to invest in sports events. But the global economy, you might remember, cratered in 2008 in September, and the price of oil dropped significantly. Lula was still popular when he left office in 2011. But the drop in oil prices, the costs of the World Cup in 2014 and the Olympics in 2016 ended Brazil's ascendancy into the world of the big boy economy. Where's Obama? Demanded Richard Pound, International Olympic Committee delegate from Canada, Montreal lawyer. Where's Obama? Olympic bids are so important these days to countries that it would be surprising for a country not to send its biggest hitter. If the US doesn't match the others, that's something that will be noticed. Obama did show up in Copenhagen at the last second, but it was all wired for Brazil and the president, known simply as Lula. The IOC wanted the South American Olympics, and even Obama admitted that Lula was the most popular politician on earth. And he got Brazil the 2026 Olympics. 21st century Olympics, IOC demands local governments pay for any debt accumulated by the games. After all, they're a sovereign nation, just ask them. Sydney is still paying hundreds of millions of Australian dollars to maintain unused facilities from the 2000 Olympics. The United States had more troops on the ground in Utah to protect the Salt Lake City Olympics in 2002, then in Afghanistan after the September 11th, 2001 attacks. 21st century, London rebuilt the East End with the Olympics. No word on what it cost. Sochi. Did it really cost $51 billion? That's what people say. Rio, well, people have gone to jail in Rio. The International Olympic Committee wanted to host the games in South America, but the Brazilians were not happy and began protesting before the games. South Korea 2018, big money loser, but South Korea did invite North Korea to participate in the games, and they did. And that's Thomas Bach. He's the head of the International Olympic Committee. Legacy? Well, Bach says that the Olympics have never been as successful as they are today. There are TV deals through 2032 with Comcast, sponsorship at least through 2028. They can't ignore, though, that they have an issue with the candidate process. Lots of cities don't want it. Oh, the politicians and business leaders want it. But the people who actually pay the bills, the taxpayers, the taxpayers of Los Angeles that have to put up $250 million to help with expenses for the LA Games in 2028, or California, also $250 million, $500 million total from California going to help pay for the cost of those games. Lots of cities don't want them. There seems to be only one that wants the 2032 games. That's Brisbane, Australia. And the games are used for political purposes by groups in some countries. Bach did not want to go into detail about that. So the games scheduled to start, in about 28 days. Spectators only from Japan. Oh, let me add one other thing about the spectators. The people who already bought ticket packages, plane, all that other stuff from groups, they're suing because those packagers have said that, well, this was an act of God and we're not responsible for returning your money to go to Japan because this was something totally out of our control. Totally out of our control. Other thing is the Uyghurs. I don't know how many of you are following the Uyghurs in China. Human rights groups are saying that they are being repressed and human rights abuses are going on in China right now with the Uyghurs. Mitt Romney, who ran the 2002 Salt Lake City Olympics, doesn't think that the United States should boycott the Olympics. And by the way, China's vaccine doesn't seem all that successful right now, places like Uruguay. Even though China offered to give vaccines to every Olympian. But Mitt Romney says, well, maybe we shouldn't boycott the Olympics. Let's get tough on China, but we should send our team there. Joe Biden hasn't really made a decision on whether or not to boycott the 2022 Olympics. So once they get done with the COVID Olympics, which may happen in 4 weeks, and the Paralympics, which may happen in about 7 weeks, the next issue on the political table is the plight of the Uyghurs in China. Oh, and by the way, there are trials going on all around the world about how the IOC may have been bribing some people to get Olympics in various places like Tokyo. That's happening right now. So big business. It's a great athletic event. And some people spend their entire lives trying to win a gold medal. And it's in archery. It's not in the sports where people pay to play. Anyway, thank you so much for inviting me. Any questions, any answers, any comments? The floor is all yours.
Thank you so much. Let me stop the recording and then we can do any questions. Just one moment.
I know Kent has a bunch of things to say.
All right, hang on 1 minute.
But let Kent go last. Let him go last. Let other people go first because he's